prisons in Michigan. And one of the reasons that I bring that up, even though that was a very different kind of work and a long time ago for me now, is, I reflect back on how many of the incarcerated men I was working with at that time were talking about and planning for how to build peace in their communities when they came home, even though I didn't have the vocabulary and sort of the frame of reference to fully understand it in that way at the time. But when I think of a lot of the things they were thinking about and planning for and what they wanted to create when they came home, it was really a lot about that. So happy to be here, part of the conversation.
Thank you. We're happy you can be part of it. Christy, can you please go next?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christy Love. I'm the Interim Executive Director for the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. I have to offer a verbal congratulations to Lashana. I thought that was great news, a great way to start this session. And I have a feeling this is going to be one of those sessions where maybe I, receive more and learn more than what I'm able to contribute. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those who may not know what CJCC is, we are an independent district government agency. And our role really is to help coordinate the efforts of both the local and federal criminal justice agencies in the district. And so CJCC, we're an agency, but we also work on behalf of CJCC, which is a council. And that council consists of elected leaders as well as appointed leaders who are heads of various criminal justice and public safety agencies in the district. In terms of how we're involved in this work, back in 2018, when the CJCC noticed, or our council noticed that we were starting to see an increase in gun violence, our council members made that a priority to focus on this and made it a goal to reduce gun violence in the district. And so we were able to connect with David Muhammad, and others who are doing this work just to try to bring information and analysis to our leaders so that they could take action. And so the CJCC really has four core functions. It's to facilitate information sharing, it's to conduct research and analysis, to facilitate the collaborative decision-making, and also provide training and technical assistance. And I feel like I'm probably a good segue into David Muhammad because he has, and NICJR has helped us to accomplish that goal.
Thanks, Christy. And I always gain a lot of wisdom when I talk with you. So I know I will learn from you tonight as well. David, please.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Muhammad, the Executive Director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. A lot of involvement in DC and in this area. Not only a Howard University grad, but worked in DC government for 5 years at DYRS. And for the past, so our work, the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, is based in Oakland, California, but we work in cities throughout the country. I've done a lot of work in DC and plan to continue to do so. And we work around criminal justice reform issues as well as violence reduction issues. Personally, I got involved in this. Actually went to Howard for journalism. I always say, how the heck did I get involved in this stuff? But I, in '97, started teaching writing workshops in juvenile facilities as a journalist. And then that turned me into working in this field. And so in DC, we have done a series, we have conducted a series or conducted research and issued a series of reports. First was this landscape analysis that we did a series of interviews with folks and looked at what the district was doing and included some recommendations. That was primarily in partnership with the Public Welfare Foundation in DC. Then, as Christy mentioned, partnering with the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, conducted this detailed analysis of gun violence, what we call the gun violence problem analysis. Very good cooperation from DC government and community stakeholders. Folks may have seen that. You never know what reports it seem to be in every darn news agency that exists. But I don't know if it was a slow news week or something, but folks may have seen that report. we certainly can share it with anybody who hasn't. But we think the importance of that is really understanding the gun problem that folks have in the district. You know, for instance, I think there are a couple of headlines for the average person, right? I know a lot of folks attracted to these meetings might be very involved, so these things may not be headlines to you, but I think for the general public, that the average age of a homicide suspect was 20, I think 8, was, I think, very surprising to people. The deep amount of criminal justice involvement that folks had previously, and a few other things that we can talk about. And then we're currently right at the end, and Chris, you'd be happy to hear that I think we just put some of the final edits to this, like literally before getting onto this call, to the DC Strategic Gun Violence Reduction Plan. And this also is in partnership with the CJCC, a little bit of public welfare, but then also with the Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the district. Two other quick things. What we'll talk about tonight, and I think unveil tonight, Rachel, is in partnership with PCDC, is an analysis of the cost of gun violence in the district. We have done these analyses in a few cities around the country, and took special care here in DC to try to calculate very conservatively the costs of gun violence, meaning direct cost to taxpayers. I'll talk more about it later. And then the last thing I'll just say by way of introduction is we are also, NICJR is also helping to lead an initiative out of the White House, out of the Biden administration, called the Community Violence Intervention Collaborative. I had the honor and pleasure of being at the White House yesterday with the president and vice president, which was cool. The event itself, the content wasn't that great, but to be at the White House was cool. But Washington, D.C. is one of 16 cities in the initiative, and NICJR is the technical assistance coordinator around that. Looking forward to this discussion, getting into this a bit more, and thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here, and we're excited to dig into more of that data in a few minutes. Last but not least, Emily Thierry, please.
Hi, yes, I'm a senior research associate. I work with Jesse in the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And I always knew that I wanted to do research and policy, but I actually never originally intended to focus on justice policy. I originally was focused on sort of health policy and public health. But as I sort of worked on projects and got more experience, I realized, and I think this is sort of a good preview of like the themes of interconnectedness that we'll get into later, is that all of these things are so interconnected. Like there's a lot of intersections between health, public health, and justice and violence. And so as a result of those sort of realizing those intersections, I ended up focusing more on justice policy issues. And I have been lucky to have been able to work on several sort of DC specific projects while at Urban, including a few focused specifically on gun violence. And I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the panel.
Thanks, Emily. And you're right. I don't even say public safety without saying public health anymore. I feel like they're so interconnected, and so many other things as well. So just so everyone knows, we have a series of questions to ask this panel. And if we have time, we'd love to include questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions during the course of the event or comments that you'd like to make in the chat, you're most welcome. We do have lots of questions to get through, so I'll jump right in and circle back to you, David. And, you've already mentioned the cost of gun violence report. We're really excited to have just received the finished report that you on the cost of gun violence that you did for DC for Peace for DC on DC, and if you could just go into some of the details in that report, and Roger will share it in the chat. That'd be great.
Just again, as some background, so one of the many pieces of kind of research and data collection that the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform does, in addition to the direct work we do to try to implement effective gun violence reduction strategies, is an analysis of costs to local government and state government of gun violence, and trying to quantify, as I said earlier, kind of in a conservative way, the direct costs, costs that we can point to specifically and we can document specifically. And there are a tremendous amount of indirect costs that, as we say in the report, we're not calculating here somewhat deliberately, because as you'll see, $1.5 million per homicide for the district is already an extraordinary amount, and an amount that can't be argued with other than the other way, right? You could argue a lot that it's probably closer to 3 million, right? And so, and some people would say there's arguments to be made of $10 million a homicide when you, over the life of somebody who is either deceased and or in prison for 25 years of life, the lost production costs. And so what we did, and I'll share just very quickly, is this report. And again, really want to appreciate Roger and Rachel and Peace for DC for the push and support to do this, and the push to get it done by today, which we appreciate. And really, again, the narrative just talks about DC and talks about this work, and looking at when you think about when a shooting occurs, there's the crime scene itself, there's a hospitalization and often a rehabilitation, there's the criminal justice system involvement, there's the incarceration when, DC has some of the highest clearance rates of any place in the country. So I think in 2020, there was a 70% clearance rate, and that means the solve rate for homicide cases. And so the vast majority of people, despite some current rhetoric going around, do end up being arrested and incarcerated for these. There is victim support money that often is paid for out of government dollars. And then there is what we took as the very documentable lost tax revenue, although there's much larger amounts that we could for on the indirect. And looking at each of those costs, and we broke it down per cost, again, as we'll show in a minute, each of which has a very documentable source, looking at all of these costs, that a homicide has a $1.53 million per incident. And that is when there is one suspect and one victim. As we know, often there are multiple suspects and sometimes multiple victims. And an injury shooting is just shy of $1 million, or more than $783,000 of $1 million at $783,000 per incident, right? And we have, as we know, a significant increase in homicides as well as injury shootings, that the total cost to the district is in the multiple millions. And not only is this good information, and then the last page is you can look up these sources. This is, again, why the numbers are relatively conservative, because we only want to use numbers that have these documentable sources. And so where that being said, we think it is very credible and good to understand the larger costs, right? I think we'll hear a bit more about that later, that it is more that we're paying as a society, particularly over the course of the life of the individuals involved, based on these incidents. And the big point here is, therefore, we should be able to fund prevention and intervention efforts that, if you look at a per incident, and the district getting over 200 homicides per year, right? So $350 million that it's expending in government resources, and nowhere close to that amount in funding specific. And even though I think the district is to be commended for the significant amount of American Rescue Plan dollars being dedicated to this, and standing up new offices focused on this, I think the district should really be commended. That being said, there's a lot of argument to be made that much more investment could go into effective community-based violence intervention efforts. And not only will those efforts bring back a return of investment primarily about saving lives, and that really is what it should be about, but some people, unfortunately, may not be moved by that, but it brings about an actual return of investment in dollars as well. And that for every dollar invested in effective community-based violence intervention, you get 3, 5, sometimes tenfold return on that investment due to a reduction in violence, the sanctity of life, but also in a reduction in costs. And what we need to do, and we will see a reduced violence based upon some of the great work the people on this Zoom are doing. When we see that reduction in violence, we should see greater investment into you, right? And that's what Peace DC is about, and that is what we strongly urge as well. So I'll pause there. I'll resist going deeper and deeper into this because I know we want to get into other parts of this discussion. But as you said, this will be available, I believe, both on Peace DC's website as well as on our website as well. And we'll talk more about that soon.
Thank you, David. It's really just stark seeing those numbers, and you never really think about all the different aspects that go into that cost. And like you said, it's important to understand where there's the economic cost, and then there's the immeasurable cost to life, and in between there's the cost to society. And so they're all important. Obviously, the loss of life is what we want to save and focus on the most. But I think it's important to understand these other measures. And segueing to Jesse.
Let me just say, Rachel, I'm sorry. I said this in the chat, but folks know. Roger, thank you for putting the PDF in there, which is great. And then we also just added the link, and appreciate that there's Tara and others on my team on this call who made that happen right before this call to put it up on our website. So you'll see the link to the report in the chat.
And we will add it to our website as well soon. So Jesse, Urban Institute is very well regarded for research on many topics, and you have been working on a report also commissioned by Peace for DC, focused on some of the more indirect costs of gun violence in DC. And I think it'd be helpful for people to understand what we're talking about when we say indirect costs, and really why is it important to measure these factors?
Sure, and the term that we've been trying to use is community level impacts, to give a sense of how it complements what David and Nick Jr. have done, and also to be clear and set expectations for when you see this. A lot of this effort has been going into the existing research and trying to synthesize what we know about community level impacts. It's not a slightly different, it's a pretty different exercise from what Nick Jr. has done. But to lay out what we mean by community level impacts, we know, and I was really struck for folks who came in and saw the video at the beginning, how many of the people, when they were talking about gun violence in DC, were naming these community level impacts, the way that trauma shows up not only in the people who have been shot or have immediately had someone, in their lives perhaps, but at a community level, when gun violence is occurring in the community, lots of people experience secondary trauma, and it has these effects that show up at the level of the entire community. So, for example, one of the areas that we're looking at is what we know about the economic impact of that, building on, for example, or drawing on some work that colleagues at Urban had done around the impacts of gun violence at the neighborhood level on business formation. We do see that you have fewer businesses when there is more gun violence. It affects business formation. It can show up in a lot of people in the research community have looked at that in terms of housing values. It's a really good way to quantify some of the economic impact it may have. And then more broadly, I think we know that, that trauma in particular or higher levels of gun violence shows up in youth outcomes and school performance. It can be measurable in terms of people's level of stress that shows up in all kinds of health impacts. So I say all this to say that in addition to what David is naming and what Nick Jr. has gone into very deeply, there are also these community levels, neighborhood level effects that gun violence has. Again, this is not unknown, because I come back again to how many people were naming those kinds of effects when they were talking about it in the video at the start. I think our hope is that by having something to share around that attempts to, in an estimative way, quantify that a little bit, because quantified things hit with some audiences in a way that narrative doesn't, and you really need a broad coalition to build and maintain the kind of support you need for really robust strategies against gun violence. And I think the other thing that looking at community level impacts helps make clear is the way in which gun violence is a component part of trying to tackle all kinds of other issues. If you are trying to do working on economic development and all the different ways of neighborhood vitality in places where gun violence is prevalent, you have to account for that. If you want to talk about youth development and youth success in neighborhoods where there are higher levels of gun violence, you have to deal with that. If you want to think about, health disparities and all kinds of health things more broadly, not just people who may themselves experience gun violence affects that. If unaddressed, it can be so corrosive to the ability to make progress in a lot of these other issues. And I think, again, there may be some audiences where, to have a guidance to the fact that they may not think about gun violence much as they're proceeding to work on these other community level issues, but it does affect their success. It's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's almost cyclical because, the neighborhoods that are most impacted by gun violence are also the ones that have been, the most disinvested. And people may not realize that there are interventions that we can do, investments we can make directly to address the gun violence. And like you said, we can't really, you can't open a business if it's not safe. You can't walk to school and have succeed on your exam if you're distracted by gun violence. I think it's really important. And we're talking about economic costs, but we know that folks don't necessarily think about dollars as soon as they hear about gun violence. People have an emotional reaction. There's fear and grief and anger and trauma, not just experiencing it, but even just hearing about it. People reading the news today, every day. So Dr. C, can you tell us from your perspective, how are gun violence and trauma intertwined, and what are some of the mental, emotional, physical impacts of trauma on a person?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to David and Jesse for sort of framing up some of the specific impacts on society. I'd like to take just a bit of a step back. I was once at a very interesting conference, and there was a Native woman who brought forth sort of indigenous culture around grounding, sort of where are we, why are we there? And of course, she gave, homage to the specific land we were on and all of those things, which was super impactful, though, just in terms of us grounding what we're talking about. And when we think about mental health, and as a practitioner, if anyone is suspected to be in some type of psychosis, we always want to check to make sure that they're oriented properly. Do they know who they are, where they are, and sort of what the date is, right? So person, place, and time. Well, who are we talking about? Sort of where are we? And if we frame this more systemically or globally, then we have to really get honest about the fact that we're in a violent country that has been violent since the beginning, came to be through violence. That little shift, not that all is news to all of us, right? But just calling it out reorients us to appropriately framing discussion in that it's just that nudge sometimes, especially depending on who people are and what their vantage point or perspective is. And sometimes it's not always in alignment with partnership with community, if you will, that we're looking at responses and not necessarily initiators or responders and not initiators, right? There are catalysts, but the people and the communities we're talking about aren't often the catalysts, right? Then, who are we talking about? We're talking about the same populations who've been systemically over time, most often in the highest level of concentration, right? Imprisoned and in communities, as you said, that have been disproportionately just restricted, oppressed. But even to take it a step further, the people who often engage in gun violence were babies born into these communities. And it's really sweet and easy to find empathy and easy to find understanding at 6 weeks and 6 months and even 6 years. And then at 16, something switches. And it becomes difficult for people to understand that that's been 16 years of pure terror and torture and constriction and restriction and literally withholding access to necessary resources. And we can easily see it and name it when we see it on the news, especially in other places in the world. And we've seen that play out. It's just so very sad. These are just children and their homes were bombed or blown up, or their parents were killed right in front of them. And also right here in Washington, D.C. every night. And do you understand that? Not every night, unfortunately, but every week, every 2 weeks, every month, however you want to put it, right? And so then what's the conversation that we're really having? What are we talking about if we properly orient ourselves? We're talking about equity. And that's the shift. That's the piece where how much trauma do we think is too much trauma for certain communities? How much is it important to name it as trauma and to say it's a public health crisis? This is the pandemic of our time. And it takes all of us. And the reason that it's good to take that global perspective is because at some point, I think someone used the word, Jesse, I think it was you, corrosive. At some point, we got to get honest about the fact that there's not that much separation between Ward 1 and 8. There's not enough separation. You can't outrun all of the bullets. You can't outrun all the guns that were dropped in these communities that these folks didn't manufacture, right? So in that case, maybe it becomes a little more important to you. You can't, we're running out of space to open new businesses in new spaces. So you're going to have to come right to the community at some point, or it's going to come right to you. So then does it matter? So the idea, it brings me to Angela Glover Blackwell's work, this curb cuts, the curb cut effect. So she was founding executive director of policy Lincoln Oakland, right? And so if you know the curb cut effect, but I just sort of pay it forward because it's about literally curb cuts. And back when folks who had limited mobility needed access, right? And it would be easier if we cut all the curbs in the country. And there were a number of activists in favor. And then people are like, why would we take all of these government resources? Why do we care about Congress Heights? I don't live there. They can just do whatever they do. They need to know how to just stop by now. And what ended up happening was, of course, we know we all have curb cuts. And so it got through and it was mandated federally. And the moms with the strollers and the skaters and the cyclists and the delivery folks, the couriers, the people traveling with luggage, we all use curb cuts, and it made the country better and more accessible for all. Well, let's think about that when it comes to trauma. It is all encompassing. It affects all of us. We're all going to encounter, if we haven't already, some level of trauma. But this level of complex, compound, vicarious, secondary, all at once trauma is a recipe for exactly what we're seeing. It's the intended outcome. Nothing else can come of it. No one gets broken and says, I'm fixed. You break a glass on the floor, it's going to be in a million little pieces, and you can glue it and you can say, but they had a violence interrupter. And that's what often happens too in this conversation. Well, it's trauma informed care. And isn't that enough? How many healing circles are we going to have? Well, how many pieces of the glass are broken? And how does it look when you put it back together, and does it stay fully together? And so when you think about, another good text specifically around trauma, the body keeps the score. It's at the very like most fibrous level. It manifests as illness, it manifests as different functioning neurologically. The synapses are firing all together differently. And so when we understand it there, and I kind of do that 30,000 foot level because systems transformation is what's important, the people will be the better for it because they shouldn't have been in it in the first place. And we can roll back that onus and reposition the conversation when folks say, well, they've had $3 million. And it's just, I mean, throwing money at the problem isn't working. Well, how much were you willing to spend on David's report to incarcerate them? What if you maybe gave them a house to live in, maybe a decent school, food, the things that people who tend to do well and don't have this level of exposure to pain and terror and, warlike conditions have? And then we see different outcomes. And so, trauma is what it is. It is all encompassing, very, very severely impactful. It's not linear. It moves like this. It's the same way. The thing I can liken it to is most closely, which I think will make sense for all of us, is like grief. You can understand, I was doing okay and then something. And it's also like the number of resources that you have. If I have, 10 cards and I was doing fine, I have, everything I need, enough resources to get through the week, the day, the year. And then you start taking them and taking them and taking them. So now I'm not fully resourced. I'm not stable. I'm not standing fully rooted and strongly sort of planted. So then anything can knock me over. I can go for anything. I can do anything. And I think all of us, when we think about this as humanity, can understand that, we all have those days where it's like, not today. I've already had a flat tire, water pipe broke in my house. Anybody can get it today, Okay, so imagine, when you talk to the real, like the population, and we take away the shackles and we take away the stigma and all the things that folks say they don't want to engage in behavioral health. They do. They don't want to engage in judgment. They don't want to engage in bad services. They don't want to engage in folks who aren't culturally competent and specific. They don't have time to explain to us the difference between, Simple City and Sursum Quarter. That's our responsibility. Be a student of our own community. Understand the nuances, right? But once you get to it, I haven't found one person who's perpetrator of gun violence who hasn't been able to name, when you say, well, how many people have you ever lost? I used to ask this question, have you ever seen a dead body or witnessed gun violence? How many, have you lost anyone to violence? And so then they say, you mean this week? How many? Are you asking how many or if it ever happened? Are you serious? I lost count. It was my best friend. It was my brother. It was my dad. My sister. Right across the street from here, my sister was shot in the head. And then down the street, my brother. These are things that never are even in the psyche of more privileged populations, right? And so, and let alone over and over again. And so all that's to say that we know the compromised state that our folks would naturally be in, which is a human response. And so how are we going to cut the curbs or not? What are we going to do?
Wow. Well, you took that question and answered it and then some. And thank you. Just thinking, the difference between how we treat the 6-year-olds and the 16-year-olds, there's just so much in there. Thank you. I'd love to do a follow-up later. Christy, I want to talk to you about CJCC's work with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform and the recently published problem analysis and soon to be published strategic plan. I want to understand how the government, the DC government, uses this research to inform citywide gun violence reduction efforts.
I feel like we're making a hard turn here